Welcome to Hilltop Podcast. I'm Tony Alvarado, and I have the privilege of facilitating the pilot podcast series. And for today's podcast, we have Ruoyun Killian, who is an unbelievable, amazing, remarkable graduate of the Bill Munday School of Business in Austin, Texas at St. Edward's University. And she, as we were talking right before the podcast, checks all the boxes. So we're in for a treat. Help me welcome Ruoyun, and I will let her kind of tell us a little bit about where and how her journey started at St. Edward's University, and then we'll really take some deep dives. You're going to love our guest today. Ruoyun, take it away.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Ruoyun Killian. I am a 2013 graduate from St. Edward's University in marketing. And I also sit on the St. Edward's University Bill Munday School Advisory Board. It has come full circle after 10 years of being coming from the Hilltop. And my day-to-day consists of being a human-centered business and marketing advisor for fast-expanding companies like I've worked with Serenity Kids, which is one of the fastest growing baby food brands, Rebel Cheese, one of the fastest vegan cheese brands around, so a lot of product-based brands. And I've also ran an agency for 5 years, C3 NAMI, where we worked with clients like Big Commerce and really implement the human-centered marketing theory and helping them build relationships at the human level. Because my favorite quote from Simon Sinek is, people do business with people. And that's where brand loyalty is built. And when we're entering a recession or any pandemic or in these uncertain times, quote unquote, most used phrase since 2020, it is the brand loyalty that is how brands can continue being able to grow sustainably.
So everything today is about the identity. Mm-hmm. It is about who you are. And students, I think, are facing unbelievable opportunities, but also some pretty tough challenges out there. So I'm hoping in our conversation, we also give them the benefit of some of your insights when you were a student. Mm-hmm. Because if we were to think back 10 years ago to where you were then to where you are now, I think we're going to be very interested in how you navigated that stream. And in a kind of a very interesting, perhaps ironic way, you've come full circle to not just, look at the great social digital media opportunities, but you came back and you said human-centered is what it's all about. So let's talk about that a little bit more, because right now, it doesn't matter whether you're a small business, a startup, or big corporate giants. Everybody's facing some brand identity problems because of all the turmoil that's going on in our community. So let's dive a little deeper into that human-centered. What is it that got you back to square one?
So I've actually always been at square one. I've actually hated everything that was originally said. So my default is that if you preach and live and breathe Tony Robbins and Gary Vee, you are probably not my ideal client to work with. My ideal clients are people who genuinely care about impacting their communities and creating an innovation product or service for the betterment of their community that they serve, not just make money, get rich. And this is a reflection of our society. So when I graduated in 2013, for an individual entering the workforce, it was still the age-old question since probably 1940s and later, because we have to understand that the workforce evolution has changed. In the 1910s and 1920s, the workforce was called the employed. It's not. And then it was not until the 50s and 60s that we started asking the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? What do you want to do when you grow up? So that's a psychological change as a society. And when I entered the workforce in 2013, it was still that what do you want to be? What do you want to do when you grow up? And I entered in working in a smaller agency, but we did everything as large as South by Southwest events during Pan Americana to working with larger brands. I worked from intern all the way up to being their head of operations, and then started hitting a lot of walls in that and realized that what I nerded on was not how to run a brand in every single facet of marketing, even though that's my nerdiness. It's about the digital side, because that was at the forefront. I was doing marketing on social in 2010 before Facebook had business pages. I jokingly call myself a social media grandma, although young ones like to call me a pioneer in the industry. And so I went there, and then I moved and started my agency. And when I started my agency in 2015, a lot of people asked two things. Why do I need social media? Is it just SEO? And then they had two options. They either looked around their room and said, you're a millennial, you should know how to do social media, right? Or they work with a mega large agency who does branding really well and give an arm and a leg, or they get sold a scam from like a company that says they do social media, but they really don't do social media. They just do it as a transactional distribution thinking perspective. And a lot of small, medium-sized businesses got burnt, right? Because they either dump millions of dollars into advertising or they're bust. And the irony of all of that is now paid ads is like the worst thing that you can spend money and budget on. That's the irony now. It's because we've hit saturation. If everybody's dumping millions of dollars, you're not going to be able to compete. But it's like, great, you put in ad dollars and then you grew, but then you hit a plateau, and it's either, and because ad dollars is diminishing returns, right? Because if it's only focused on getting new customers through the door, but you don't care about them afterwards, then you completely wasted the value of what it took to get a new customer through the door. So again, brand loyalty, and that all funnels in. But the shift was in 2015. Most companies, when I asked them, because I'm Asian, and I think in 25-year sprints, that's how we're raised. We think very long-term. We're not a short-term society in that culture. And so I asked, what is your 25-year goal? And most of them was get rich in 5 years and sell. And that just made me feel super icky. And I was like, okay. That was also the era of when Uber was born, and now we're seeing the death of Uber because of their loss of funding with VCs, because they weren't sustainable. It was burn money, grow fast, and just have constant growth without acknowledging the human cost and the actual environmental cost or anything like that. And then by 2018, though, we started seeing a shift of social media. The companies that come to me was, I get the value of social. I actually built my company because I care about X. In the end, they basically looked around the room or their industry and saw no one else do it the way that they could do it. And so they just went in. These are what I call the superhuman fixers of clients. They're like the superhumans. They were super passionate. And the irony of that is that those brands are also the ones that are suffering the biggest burnout still if they maintain that drive that happened.
So let me unpack some of what you said.
I know, I'm just give the history transition.
You have given us an encyclopedia here, but I'm going to concentrate on a few words and see if I can connect them to students. So one of the key words that I picked up was innovation. And you started as a founder of a company. Was that C3 NAMI? Okay. And at some point, you probably didn't know that you were an entrepreneur. And now we're all about entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial mindset and entrepreneurial grit. How did you know when you founded C3 NAMI, how were your antenna fixed on the atmosphere and the ecosystem to know, that's the opportunity? How did you recognize the opportunity? How did you connect it to that entrepreneurial mindset that you may or may not have thought you had? How did you make those connections?
So let's actually dive a little deeper and unpack what is the definition of an entrepreneur. Because entrepreneur, you and I have talked about this all day long. We're entrepreneurism is insanely romanticized. Everyone's have a side gig, do this thing, side hustle, get your stuff, working for a corporate doesn't feed you, blah, blah, blah. That's all that's being said. They're you get to choose your own hours. I'm yeah, great. You get to choose what 70 hours you get to work. That's the reality of starting a business. It's not for the faint of heart. A true entrepreneur is what we describe as a complete innovator, where they have to what I said earlier, they looked around the room. They saw no one else be able to do it the way that they want to do it. And it is aligned to their inner being that they are meant to ride this wave and make this change in this big way. However, the world has shifted to where not everyone needs to be a change maker in that traditional sense of being an entrepreneur. Companies are recognizing that they can grow leaders who are actively making change in their company, big or small. They can take this innovation factor, this need, the creativity, the actual piece of evolution that we're looking for. Because humans are constantly evolving. Companies die and humans get depressed when they resist that evolution. Change is constant. The question, that's just a life lesson 101. Change is constant. Now, in the river of life, and you can choose to flow with change or stand still and get whiplash.
All right. And how would you say you overcame the barriers and challenges that no doubt you faced as a woman, as an immigrant, and coming from a background that perhaps was culturally not aligned, but you are now at the forefront? How did you get all those dots connected?
So for me, in my entrepreneur journey, I actually ran my first company when I was 20 years old, but it was under a larger company. And the irony, and I still eat my words to this day, is that I ran the company. It was a branch under another branch. So I basically was like, here's a full entrepreneur journey, but like the operations are laid out, everything's laid out, the marketing's laid out, and you just got to go and do. So it was basically like experiencing a franchise with all the support and levels of training. And they did a fantastic job of leadership training involved in how they train people. So, and my role was to recruit and train. And I had like over 100 sales reps under me at one point, and my territory ran from all the way from the I-35 and 71
And that's here in Austin, Texas.
And here in Austin, Texas, all the way down to Bastrop, all the way down to Kyle. And I was 20. And I had all the systems and structures, and I was able to ride that journey of being an entrepreneur. But I was at 20 years old watching like tens of thousands of dollars going in and out of a bank account. That is wild. And I think a lot of people don't, like, the hardest thing for entrepreneurs is owning their own finances, because there's a lot of personal stigma associated with it. But for me, I left and finished because it was a summer long experience. I left and finished. And then I went back to college, and I was like, I don't ever want to run my own company again. I am burnt out. I am exhausted. My hyperthyroidism actually reflared from the level of stress that I experienced. And I was like, I'm not about the corporate life, but how's that small business life look like? And so that shifted my perspective. And the more I got into the workforce and then I was in the weeds, there was that juxtaposition of a lot of these small, mid-sized companies were told what was on the market of like, look for a millennial in your company to do social, hire a very expensive branding agency, or looking at a company that said they did social media, right? Like that was all that was on offer. And no one taught them how to ask the correct questions for what is good marketing. Like the number one thing that I do is talk to my client and explain what is the return on investment on their social media.
Right.
And no one talks about it.
And I think one of the things that I hear you say is being an entrepreneur does not necessarily mean having to start up your own business. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean staying away from working in a larger environment, mm-hmm. but it's about defining yourself. And now that you and your generation, and perhaps mine as well now, are looking at wellness and health, you are now talking about making sure that you are in the right space and that your mind and body are at maximum operating level, but also means you're not burning out. And I think that is one of the biggest contributions that you have made to our entrepreneurship environment, which is for young men and women to understand the sacrifices that will be made and have to be made, and basically asking the self-assessment questions. Are you ready? So let's talk about that health and wellness aspect.
Yeah, we're going to go very deep. So remember how at the very beginning I explained we had the question of like, what do you want to be when you grow up? That question doesn't really apply to the generation of children that is born today, because they are already being themselves, because their parents in very conscious parenting is a quote unquote jargon, or just that style and vein of parenting is allowing that human being to foster in their truest iteration of themselves.
Wow.
And that's the shift that we're seeing today.
Wow. So let's repeat that again, because that is pretty deep, but it's also right on target. Say it again.
So we are in this era where, especially my generation, we realize that we were born, and this is just human experience, which is children are born with the truest understanding of who they are, but society strips that away in order for them to conform.
All right. So you might be crazy good, but you have to conform to the world instead of staying crazy good.
Yeah. The reality is that there's no one pathway of success. It is not the board game of life, linear materialistic gains. Life is really like open world Legend of Zelda, exploration, character development, growth. My favorite example is like, if the real world is like, if you don't have the heart and stamina and all the things, even if you get the fancy sword, aka materialistic gains, even if you get that, but if you're not mentally ready for it, you're only going to wield like 90 damage versus 9,000 damage. And I'm using total gamer language because I am a gamer, but it is the reality of life to that. And so this generation, my generation, who are entering parenthood, I am technically a zillennial, which is where I'm millennial, but I'm also Gen Z. Like I sit in that smack dab little corner, so I can still use Gen Z language without being cringe like an older millennial. But my generation, who are parents, we had to heal a lot to avoid a generational trauma. And there's generational trauma as minority in like the system and the pain, but also the culture. Like we grew up, like myself personally, I grew up where as an Asian American, but as a first generation immigrant into the US, by the age of 6, I was having to translate legal documents to my parents.
Wow. So in effect, as a role model, you have charted the course, navigated it in a manner which also is pretty interesting, because we tend to stereotype ourselves into, oh, you're a boomer, you're a millennial, you're a Gen Zer, you are whatever. Mm-hmm. And you've managed to kind of find your little corner, a little niche, and say, well, don't pigeonhole me so fast. I can actually be in more than just one generational mode. And that has enabled you really to transform and evolve into the person that you are. And one of the things that I've had the privilege of knowing you for over 10 years and seeing you at St. Ed's and now, as the professional expert that you are, dare I say influencer, because that's a connotation that maybe takes us in a different way. But ultimately, you are enjoying what you do. And it's bringing out the best in you. And that at the very end of our conversation today will be sort of, what are the takeaways? And one of those takeaways is going to be people looking at you and saying, well, I'm my own person. I'm not, Ruoyun, but
right.
I am able to learn from her journey. And so how did you figure out what brings out the best in you so that you
right.
can enjoy a bit of work-life balance, another term of art that perhaps doesn't mean much.
Yeah. So how did you do it? Right?
How did you do it?
Right. It's like when people look at Oprah, you're like, oh my God, Oprah owns like Oprah 70 things, or Richard Branson who owns Virgin 50 different companies. And you're like, but they just look so happy and content. And that's the key thing. It's not just happy, or it's the content and confidence. And if we use a term, thriving. So, and I want to do another truth bomb. Thriving is a human right.
Thriving is a human right.
We are not here on this earth to just survive. And I will say our systems are designed in the current state because, again, we have to, this is why I give the encyclopedia history cliff notes at the beginning, is at the beginning, the workforce was considered the employed, right? In the early 1900s, most human beings were surviving at the very pure survival level. And so, but we're entering a world where we are in first world countries, and there's more first world countries than ever. But we still think in this space of survival. And I'm not negating that there is still the poor, there's still groups of people, but if we look at the total population, most people, there is like a significant population that is considered middle class, but they still operate like they are in lower income. And I personally came from lower income. Like my mother made less than 20K a year, and we lived off that.
So a couple of things that I wanted to feed off. Mm-hmm. What comes across is your passion. The passion not just to survive, but to thrive. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the characteristics that traditionally we talk about in the entrepreneurial space, that you have to have a passion for something. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, how did you get the passion for the marketing, human-centered digital marketing, however you want to define it? How did you find that passion? How did it come about? At this point, we're going to add a recording note. We're about to address a very difficult subject, which may be highly emotional for all of us. If you are uncomfortable, we would suggest that you fast forward to about the 24-minute mark and take up the conversation at that point. Is it cultural? Is it upbringing?
No,
is it education? Can you learn it in the classroom? How did you get it?
No, I actually was on track to do every Asian American experience, which is to either be a doctor or be a lawyer. I, at the age of 16, survived suicide. And I proudly call myself a suicide survivor. And the journey that got me to that darkness was being ostracized at every single level. Human beings are social creatures. We seek belonging. And I was completely isolated to that point. And it's a very dark place. It is a muffled, dark hole, and you feel constantly exhausted. And for me, my 16-year-old self chose to live. So I owe it to my 16-year-old self to not waste a single second. And so essentially, in a nutshell, I face my own mortality. And that's the shift. The shift where we go from this thinking that to be successful at life is be successful in our career, have a lot of money, have a kid, have a house. That's the board game of life. Linear, down a path, very board game. But in 2020, the world, quite literally the world, doesn't matter what position you're in life, we were faced with our mortality. And we were asked this very big question of, if you don't exist in the next 72 hours, what matters?
Right. And Ruoyun, that's so powerful. I've had many conversations with you. I learn something about you and from you every time, but sharing the experience of you're facing that dark space, that's very powerful, very moving. And we are blessed that we have you with us and that you have overcome. And yet that message and that takeaway is we have got to empathize with our audience, students, wherever you are. You're experiencing probably similar type of barriers, perhaps not quite as
extreme.
Overwhelming or extreme, right? Yeah. But it seems to me that one of the things that is a trigger that takes us maybe there or takes us out of there is the role of technology and our dependence on the digital device world and how we get addicted in some ways.
They're entertainment apps.
Exactly. And I think the entrepreneur in you obviously explored all the opportunities out there, and you were a gamer. So how do you avoid that addiction? How do you avoid putting it in perspective? Because you have just put our life in perspective, Ruoyun, by what you've just shared with us. I mean, what's important and what's not. And then that's going to take us back to St. Edward's University and the Holy Cross mission and the values that an institution like St. Edward's gives you, the anchors. And that's, again, a whole different topic, perhaps of a different podcast, but let's go there.
Yeah, let's go there. So the digital world, people get I could just sense people who are listening to this like, oh God, here we go. Like there's a lot of preconceptions, but the core is technology is inherently neutral. Technology gives you access, and social media is a direct reflection of human society, the good and the bad. Now, when that happens, then we are faced with the most intense version of that. And we have to grapple with it, aka human beings have to have critical thinking, emotional compassion, and the willingness to collaborate in order to resolve any issues that flurry. We have to understand is that these apps, they are media apps. They are entertainment apps. The intention of the creators of these apps is for people to stay on the app as long as possible. And it is first and foremost an entertainment app. And so it is more of a TV than a actual like social networking space. Now, there are certain apps like LinkedIn that garners more towards like a digital networking room style scenario than like TikTok, which is like quite literally a TV app in short form. So we have variations of them. But again, social media is just about reminding people. When I talk about the ROI of social media and why it's important is we look at the marketing funnel and everyone thinks of the marketing funnel coming in, but no one realizes that's actually an hourglass shape and there's a bottom funnel, and it's all the things that you do with what I talked about earlier, which is if you only focus on new customers coming in, but you don't care about them coming back, you lose the value of that person, because the value of that person is the cost. So it's cost of acquisition for them, but then their value. Because if you nurture that relationship, they'll come back and they'll bring a friend. And if you make them love you, then you get a stand-em, not just a fandom, but a stand-em, where they're so loving of you that they're going to bring everyone and their mother, their grandma, everyone in between with them. They're going to like talk about you. They're going to be your diehard fans. Does that mean that you need to have some boundaries in place in that relationship? Absolutely, to that extent, but that's how it is. But the social media as a technology is literally just to remind people and stay you top of mind so people come back through the door. It serves two functions in the marketing space. One, credibility build, right? People, before anyone has a one-to-one conversation with a human, they're going to search them. They're going to be like, who are you? What do you do? Google search you. things like that. And especially in the public space when you're doing a lot of business networking and things like that, like me, it makes absolute sense to do that and have because I'm more outward facing. Having an online persona makes sense so that people will get a sense of who I am and come through the funnel, and then they stay because they want to work with me and the experience that I provide. So if I do a Cliff Notes described lecture of marketing and how to amplify branding, is if we use that hourglass as an example, your down the funnel experience is setting the expectation of the relationship that you're cultivating with your customer. But then your social media is a place where you're reminding them again and again why their experience with you is so good.
I love what you just said. I've heard it put in that context that social media is simply the reminder, and that technology is but a tool. And it comes back to where we were just a short while ago when we started describing who you are and how you define yourself. And it was about human-centered marketing. And you've brought it full circle back that if I understand correctly, don't have a strong relationship with other people, our consumer, our client, our customer, then we've missed the target. And I love what you've also said in terms of the marketing funnel being an hourglass, and that we teach and do a very effective job, I think, of the marketing funnel, the traditional one. But we forget about, the hourglass has another piece to it. Right. And that is your customer going to return? Right. And I guess what they call, what's the churn rate, right? Yeah. What's the turnover? And what's the cost of acquisition? Right. And it's all about, you have a customer value. Why don't you preserve that? Because it's a lot easier to spend your time, prioritize it on valuing an existing customer than it is to go after someone that may not even know that you exist. And it actually is easier. That person that may never know you exist is the best customer, is a word of mouth customer. You don't need to do a lot of hard sell if you have someone inviting them in. They're already on the same vein. Birds of a feather flock together, right? Like, it's that mentality. And you know who's the best word of mouth provider for you? Your employees. Wow. They are your partners. Whether legally they're partners or not is a different question. But does that... They're the life force of your company. Exactly. But does that translate even more today with the present generation than it did in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s? It wasn't built until the 50s or 60s. So in the 70s and 80s, if we go back to a quick historical lesson real quickly, is in the 70s and 80s, that's when you started seeing brands create personas. Right? Like, that's when you started seeing like the vibe of Tide, the mascots, the experience, right? Like, their brands started having human tendencies, if you will, so that they can be relatable. Because that's the first step into building trust, is being relatable, right? Like, that's the big thing. And only luxury brands are the single brand where like being exclusive is a thing. Like, that's the only category. Everything else, it's about relatability. And even luxury brands have to be relatable to a certain extent. Right. Bingo. So we are broadcasting, recording from the second floor Digital Media Center at the Munday Library at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. And I don't think these walls have heard the conversation of this nature and caliber, I would dare say, because we have really traipsed the light fantastic of entrepreneurship marketing. But we're going to end on a high, and that's the value system that Holy Cross Mission and Vision has at St. Edward's that imbues, hopefully, students, staff, faculty, all of us with a different perspective, because today it seems like the marketing world gets lost with all the social media distractions and all the externalities that are going on. And just before we began our recording, We talked about, well, we could spend a lot of time with the Bud Light fiasco or not challenge crisis communication.
Well, let me just tie it back into why heart and ethos is experience, and why St. Edward's, one of the things that from my experience at St. Edward's, and why when we talk about recruiting, because I used to recruit and grow interns into my company that grows into consultants. And I also do that today for clients, because what I do as an advisor is build out their marketing teams. So I advise them on how to seek and look for people. And St. Edward's is one of those universities where it's not just practical or theoretical. It's a combination of both, and it's what we call critical thinkers. They're creative strategists is who we actually recruit in the marketing arena, where they are creative doers, but they like to ask why. They go back to why are we creating this content to serve what part of relationship that is being built on social media? They are naturally, because they're digital natives, right? This younger generation, they naturally have that filter. This is when we talk about, did this marketing land surface level or did it land deep? And they're going to ask you why and how can we create this content to land deep? Now, will they have the best language to eloquently ask that question? Usually not. It takes about 2 to 3 years in the real world for them to actually figure out that language, unless they do a lot of internships. I would even venture that when I talk about human-centered marketing and give language and do continued education and I speak at conferences, I get senior marketers who are like, oh my God, that deep why that I always ask about, you're finally giving me language so I can tell my CIO or my CFO who only thinks at numbers, I can be like, this is why. We have the most amount of data in the digital marketing world. And I can show you and prove to you exactly how it goes back to your ROI and your cash flow. And that's what we talk about in these conferences. But these conferences are mega conference. These are 1,000 conferences with $200 minimum entry points. That's a huge gate wall. Talk about ultimate gatekeeping. By the way, these are not conferences that I run for my programs or anything like that. These are conferences that I'm invited to speak at, right? So it's very limited information. And this is just the US. I have a friend who is in our sister city school in Asia Pacific Retsumikin in Beppu, Oita. She's a graduate from there. We connected because of St. Edward's. And we were just talking. She's actually coming to visit me this year. I'm really excited to see her again. And we were talking, and they don't really have that style of development. She was like, maybe I should get an MBA. And I was like, why? You have leadership companies. You have leadership things. I mean, you work for an American company in Japan, of course, but you should be able to have access to stuff. That's not even taught really in other cultures sometimes outside of the US. That's a very US specific experience. And so there's all of that in place for it. And so students are naturally asking all of that. This situation of Bud Light that you're talking about, that was a purely surface transaction. They surface leveled, looked for an influencer to do a quick Band-Aid to get and reach a new audience. And then it blew up in their faces. And they never bothered to actually talk to the influencer after it blew up.
And I think I've heard you talk before when you mentioned the transaction needs a receipt to basically validate company. Are you really just saying this for marketing, or do you have the receipt to show that you actually care about what you're saying, that this is part of your core values, that these are things that you want to improve the community?
Right.
And going back to Simon Sinek, his question about the concentric circle of inquiry, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
If you can't figure out why, then it all kind of falls. Right. The house of cards falls. But I know we're getting kind of toward the end of our time limit for our podcast. How do we contact you, our audience, in the event they want to talk to you in, follow-up fashion? Where do they go?
You can find me on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram. My handle is imperfectlyren, R-E-N, and that the reason behind the username is meaning that I'm imperfectly REN is the ending part of my name, Ruoyun, but also Ren in Chinese means human. So I'm perfectly human. is the meaning of that username. But,
All right. Well, want to thank a number of people. Obviously, the Digital Media Center staff at St. Edward's University and the Munday Library. For today's podcast, we've actually been joined in the studio by Dr. Douglas Carter, who is a professor of entrepreneurship in the Department of Management at the Bill Munday School of Business. So thank you, Dr. Carter, for being with us. And this is Tony Alvarado, and we hope to see you at our next episode. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.